New York City's Greenwich Village is famous for many things, one of them being the Washington Square Park Arch, and also its former folk scene and beatnik scene. However, within that history, there's a lot of dark history. There were crimes, plagues, and even an explosion. Today, we're going to learn more of the dark history of Greenwich Village, see its forgotten history, which is not really found in the guidebooks, nor the history you would find in the textbooks. I'm Ariel, you're watching Urbanist, and let's explore the secrets of Greenwich Village. Greenwich Village is located below Midtown Manhattan, and it's wedged between the West Village and the East Village. So the village crosses the entire street from east to west. Today we're going to learn about the smaller sites, the sites that really don't appear on the textbooks. The first one we're looking at is the New York Studio School of Drawing, Painting, and Sculpture. However, this particular location has a very interesting story with one of the richest women in New York City. So welcome everyone, I'm Ariel with Urbanist. Let's explore Greenwich Village and see what other sites can we see beyond the Washington Square Park Arch and the coffee shops. Now, have you been here before? Let me know. And have you been to the Whitney? Because this place was the very first Whitney Museum of American Art. Nope. So here is the New York Studio School, and for the history of this, we have to go back to 1907. 1907, Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, heiress, one of the heirs to the Vanderbilt fortune, who were known for their railroads, she fancied herself an artist. She actually never really fit in with most of the family. To her, she yearned for a lifestyle filled with paintings, sculpture, and the Greenwich Village. Here's a photo of her dressed in that typical Gilded Age dress. However, in 1907 she set up a studio a few blocks down, and she was painted by Robert Henri. This was the painting of her, and it was not allowed to be hung up at all in her home because her husband refused to hang up a painting where the woman was wearing the pants. Now, when she owned the studio, she loved giving support to her fellow artists like Robert Henri, Joan Sloan, Edward Hopper, and many others. She decided to formalize that in 1931 because she ended up realizing there was no museum that would accept American art. New York City seemed to be obsessed with European art, and hence they were always, they never accepted living artists either in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Thus, she started the Whitney Museum of American Art right here on this location, which is now the New York Studio School of Drawing, Painting, and Sculpture. So here is her making sculptures, and she was really well known for her sculptures. I'll show you another of those sculptures right over here. And inside this stucco building, pink stucco building, there's actually really cool architecture still left inside, but I'll show you some photos of how the gallery used to look like. So you could just imagine walking into the gallery back in 1931, and this is the only place where you could see the great American artists. There was nowhere else really to see American artists unless if you were visiting their lofts or small studios here in Greenwich Village or in Soho. Here's another room, the painting room. And just for comparison, here's how the front used to look like. The eagle is still original. Donald said, I bet, it's too bad that her husband wouldn't let her display the painting of her wearing pants. Yeah, you're right. I'm not sure why. I guess they were very kind of old style, and I think that's why she didn't fit in with her family during that time. Kay, welcome. It seems to be better on YouTube. Karen, thank you so much for the stars. And everyone, I apologize for the lateness. I had to go to the bathroom before doing this broadcast, and I don't live in Manhattan, so I had to find a bathroom. All the bathrooms in the park were closed, and all the bathrooms in the coffee shops were closed. And during the pandemic, there aren't any bathrooms, so I had to walk around for 15 minutes to find one. But let's go to our second stop, and let me know if you've experienced that during the pandemic. Second stop, here is the Marlton Hotel. The Marlton Hotel used to be what was called a single room occupancy building, where it's kind of in between a hostel and a flop house and a very low cost hotel. This opened up in 1900. However, it's very important for two specific reasons. So the Marlton House, we can't really see it because a huge truck is blocking it. I'll approach it very soon. The Marlton House was the home of a young and up-and-coming writer who really didn't have any success. He was staying here at a very low-cost hotel in Greenwich Village, hanging out with other beatniks like Allen Ginsberg. This man was Jack Kerouac. Inside the Marlton Hotel, he stayed with his friend Neil Cassidy. He was writing two books. He wrote La Tristeza, and he also wrote The Subterraneans, which was about interracial marriage. Very controversial books. However, those books were not published until way after he left, because when he left the Marlton Hotel, he went on the road with Neil Cassidy and wrote the book, the seminal book of beatnik culture called On the Road. So let me show you the hotel a little bit closer. Now, it was later converted into a hostel, a dorm for the new school, specifically Parsons School of Design. And then in 2003, it was converted into a hotel. Now the hotel looks very fancy. It was nowhere near this fancy when it first opened in 1900. However, the hotel ended up taking their design from F. Scott Fitzgerald's novels, and this is how it looks like inside. So we have a very kind of extravagant, late Gilded Age, early 1900s style inside this hotel. I wish I could show you inside personally. However, it's a little bit tough because of the pandemic. Here's their view from the rooftop. So let me show you the plaque. They have a plaque over here. And it's also the birthplace of one of the Ecuadorian presidents. His name was Galo Plaza Lasso. He was born here with his two parents who were involved in diplomacy. So if you're from Ecuador, you might recognize that name, Galo Plaza. And the Marlton, let me show you a little bit more of the details. They're just gorgeous. And it's actually really surprising to look at these buildings and think to yourself, these buildings used to be low-cost buildings. Used to be buildings that house kind of the wretched of society, quote unquote. At least that's the term maybe some more conservative people would have used at that time. The beatniks really didn't fit into high society. They weren't really well off. Jack Kerouac was a really severe alcoholic. Allen Ginsberg unfortunately went to various mental institutions. The beatnik culture, even Jack Kerouac was charged for accomplice to murder. He actually didn't end up serving any jail time, but he helped his friend to hide a murder weapon, Lucian Carl. So that beatnik generation was very troubled. And it's really interesting to see these such beautiful buildings that look gorgeous now. Think of it looking in the 1930s. They might have been gorgeous, but still was considered like a poor area. Let's go to our third stop. Donald said we should have our Urbanist of the World convention there someday. If we can get someone rich to sponsor it. Indeed, you know, that would be nice. One day there'll be a Urbanist major meetup. Thank you so much, Shadow, for the compliment. Reika, watching these videos are kind of your new hobby now. Great stuff. I'm so glad you enjoy it. Now, actually, I forgot one thing. The second reason why that Marlton house is important. A woman by the name of Valerie Solanas stayed here. And she wrote a very strong manifesto against all men. It's called Scum. And it was the Society for Cutting Up Men. Strong words. She was what was considered a radical feminist. Not in the context of people saying it today, oh, you're a radical feminist. No. She was so radical, she wanted to kill one of the most famous men in America. But for that story, we'll continue on for the rest of our tour. This is Valerie Solanas. And we'll learn about her a little bit more later on. Donald knows who we shot. Okay, cool. Donald, you know your history. I think a lot of people who were alive and hooked into New York City culture in the late 60s knows exactly who I'm talking about. But just you wait, everyone. Have to do Urbanist After Dark soon again, says Tori. Yes, there might be a bonus live video after this. Stay tuned. Hello, Mary from my coworker nurses in West Virginia. Ah, Mary, thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you so much for being an essential worker, if I understand your comment correctly. Hello, Susu. Hello, Ken. In the 1940s, I went to PS 41 and PS 3, though I lived in Harlem. And Reika, I'm so glad you're enjoying these videos. Hello, Clifford. Finding a public washroom in New York City and many other cities could be a challenge. It is. It is. I mean, here in New York, since you had to go through the entire rigmarole of sitting down in the restaurant in order to use a restroom, it's a bit tough, especially when there's a time constraint. Let's go back before 1970, early 1970s. I mean, actually not early 1970s, middle of the 1960s. Right here was one of the most avant-garde movie theaters in all of New York. It was called the Cinema Guild, and it hosted many underground films, including the Rocky Horror Picture Show. It was designed in the Bauhaus style. It had this very strange style. Let me show it to you. Right here. Very strange style. That was the cinema that had, I think, 500 seats and lights shining directly towards the screen. Now, the interesting thing about this is that this cinema was the very first cinema to show Rocky Horror Picture Show at midnight with live entertainment. Hence, kickstarting the very midnight movie craze that lived on until the pandemic. Unfortunately, the pandemic has killed all movie theaters. But before the pandemic, midnight movies were still a thing. Irene, what's the name of the lady? Her name is Valerie Solanas. We'll talk a little bit more about her soon. So, but right next to it, in 1970, a very famous musician that rocked the rock world opened up his own studio. His name was Jimi Hendrix, and he opened up Electric Lady Studios. Now, Electric Lady Studios is iconic. It's also designed in this weird kind of Bauhaus, modern, spatial style. If we see a photo of it inside, right here. And this is the man who opened up this place. People call this the house that Jimi Hendrix built. Now, Jimi Hendrix was a very kind of forward-thinking rocker, and he opened this place up in August 1970. However, just a few weeks later, he went over to Europe and died due to choking on his own vomit, I think due through overdose. So he got to play in his own studio very, very few times. However, this continued being one of the most famous studios in New York City history. Actually, in music history, period. David Bowie recorded Fame here with John Lennon. Led Zeppelin recorded here a few tracks of Physical Graffiti, and many, many other iconic musicians have recorded here. Another one was D'Angelo in the late 1990s, produced by one of the members of The Roots. And according to his account, as they were recording, apparently there was a huge, weird shrieking sound. They didn't know where it was coming from. And the cat, which was called Jimmy, who lived in this building, came over to the soundboard and hit a button. You know, cats sometimes hit random buttons. However, for pure coincidence, according to the Roots producer, the cat turned exactly off that shrieking sound. And according to him, there's an interview of this on YouTube, this was the reincarnated soul of Jimi Hendrix inhabiting that cat. And Jimi Hendrix also playing Cafe Wha just like around the corner. So you could just imagine the legendary recordings that happen here. It's still in service. People are still recording here. Now, let's continue on. Kay says you have a few nurses watching with you. When they get a few minutes to spare, I'd like to give them a big thank you for the fantastic work they're doing. Yeah, of course, Kay. That is amazing. Everyone, press that heart button, or if you're on YouTube, put heart emojis in the comments for the nurses, the essential workers, everyone who's helping everyone through this pandemic, and people who are not directly affected by the pandemic, like Kay, fellow urbanist. She's recovering from something else, so give your heart and support to Kay and all the nurses for helping Kay and countless other people around the world. Thank you so much. So we started at 8th Street. 8th Street is one of the main thoroughfares of this area of Greenwich Village, and we are going now to 6th Avenue. And here, on this view directly, we would have had a huge eyesore. We would have seen this view right here. What the hell was that building? Well, we're going to learn about both of them, because they tie directly to the woman we mentioned earlier, who hated men so much she shot one of the most famous artists in American history. This was the Women's House of Detention. It was the only Art Deco prison ever built. It was right here, right next to the Jefferson Market, currently the Jefferson Market Library, before it used to be the courthouse. But what happened to it? Why was it destroyed? And why was it so infamous? Well, if we look around, it definitely was an eyesore. It did not combine with any of the other architecture we're seeing around us. Donald gives many hearts. Essential workers are incredible, says Debbie. Susan, welcome. I wanted to see Jimmy UK, but unfortunately he died. Oh, Rosalind. Yeah, it must have been an amazing person to see live. Hello, Alvaro. And hello, Maribel from Puerto Rico. Thanks for the information from the metropolitan area. You're watching from Medellin. Welcome, Alvaro. Alvaro. Thought you were watching from Medellin. And hello, Mary, and welcome, everyone. Nice to see you here. If I didn't say your name, please feel free to comment again. Hello, how are you? Jose, Patricia, Geraldine, Betty, Gwen, Johan, Marcelo, and welcome, everyone. If I mispronounce your name, feel free to correct me. So now, actually, before we talk about the Women's Center, let's talk about a very famous sign, which is currently blocked due to scaffolding. So fortunately, there's scaffolding, but this is the oldest pharmacy in all of the United States of America. Bigelow Pharmacy, dating back to 1838. Bigelow Pharmacy first started just a few blocks away. However, in 1902, this is its current location, making it the oldest pharmacy in all the country. It's also one of the older neon signs in the West Village. One of the first neon signs, period, to ever be bought in New York City. It's still privately owned, and they provide some of their unique recipes still to many other vendors out there, including online. One of them is a body cream that was created first in the 1870s, and they're still using the same recipe. Frank, we'll talk about the park very soon. Stay tuned. So here is a peek inside. And you can see it's an old school pharmacy. And here's a view of how the pharmacy used to look like back in the early 1900s. Now, according to lore, a certain Thomas Edison, you might recognize his name. He's the inventor of the light bulb, or at least the man who led the invention of the light bulb. He apparently, while he was experimenting with the light bulb with his fellow engineers like Lewis Latimer, burnt his fingers. He came over here in order to get some balm to soothe his burnt fingers, according to legend. Another frequent customer was Mark Twain, who lived nearby. Now this was also a soda counter, one of the first ones in the city. Used to sell root beer floats and of course Coca-Cola. However, that ended up closing in 1984, but during that time, between the 1920s and 1984, it was a huge hangout for many of the Greenwich Village citizens. Did the pharmacy create Bigelow tea? Ooh, great question. I don't know. They definitely create cosmetic products, and I think a candle. I'm not sure if they created a tea. Good question. 100% sure. Donald says there's a sign that says trustworthy. I'm not sure if a drug store has to remind us that they're trustworthy. Good point, Donald. All right. So the detention center. One more time, let me remind you, this is what we would be looking at right now. It's the only Art Deco prison ever built in American history. Huge eyesore. That elevated train that you would see right here, that was the 6th Avenue elevator that would pass along here. Now this was the house, this was a women's prison specifically. Let's walk through what is now, I think, the garden. Let's see if we can walk through. Hey, how's it going?
Well, thank you.
Thank you. So they destroyed this later on because it gained a very terrible, terrible reputation. So in 1974, finally it was demolished, and later on it was replaced by this park. It gained such a bad reputation partly due to a book that came out by Sarah Harris called Hellhole. Yep, it was that bad. Ooh, let me show you the fountain. Now it's a gorgeous park, and also it was the scene where Miranda got married in Sex and the City. Frank, thank you so much for clarifying. So, no, they are not related, Bigelow Tea and Bigelow Pharmacy. In 1927, the first high-profile case took place here. With a woman who later became a movie star by the name of Mae West.
Is he a man?
In 1927, Mae West produced a play called Sex.
I changed my mind.
S-E-X. Now, that might not sound too harmful today, but back in the 1920s, it was seen as a big taboo.
Yes, give them all my address.
So much so that she was arrested for obscenity. This is a few clips of her movies. She's known for a great line called, where she
Take a single
says,
man, leave the husbands alone.
Well, I can always tell a lady when I see one.
if I'm good, I'm very good.
I had a
If
shooter
I'm
line
bad,
once.
I'm
Really?
better.
Was he mad? Well,
Of course, she says it much better with her classic New York City
Oh, you
accent.
were wonderful tonight.
I'm always wonderful at night.
Then, again in 1957, a woman by the name of Dorothy Day, she was a pacifist, and she was arrested for protesting against various wars and interventions of the United States of America, such as the Korean War during that time. The name of the park is Jefferson Market Library Park. Dorothy Day is now in the running to become a saint. She was an ardent Catholic, and she started the Catholic worker movement. But then also in the 1950s, another woman that was in this detention center was Ethel Rosenberg. Ethel Rosenberg was implicated as being a Russian spy with her husband. However, according to records since then, apparently Ethel Rosenberg was not actually guilty.
Yesterday it did all over. Did it help? It can even help. It helped like on my arm.
So this is Jefferson Market Library Park. Hello, Audio Slave. Welcome. And Frank says another line was, Bella, peel me a grape. And Deanna, thank you so much for the stars. Karen as well. Root beer floats equals childhood memory. It does. So, Ethel Rosenberg was detained here and then later executed in upstate New York. As I mentioned, Dorothy Day was arrested here many times, and Mae West was arrested here once. However, another woman that was brought over here, her name was Valerie Solanas, the woman we talked about at the Marlton Hotel who wrote the Scum Manifesto. She also wrote a play called Up Your Ass. Not quite the best title. And she had trouble producing it. No one wanted to get their hands on it. Unlike Mae West with Sex, that was a hit. People loved Mae West. But no one wanted to produce Up Your Ass by Valerie Solanas. She was pissed off. And she tried to gain the attention of one of the most famous artists at that time, Andy Warhol. Andy Warhol didn't like Solanas too much, but he felt bad for her and hired her in 2 different movies, one of them called I Am Man. However, she expected something in return. She expected for him to produce her play or make a movie about her play, Up Your Ass. Warhol lost interest and never contacted her again. She had an idea. If she murdered Andy Warhol, she would become famous. And if she's famous, someone is bound to produce the play. So she sent a letter to one of the producers she was talking about saying, hey, I'm about to murder the most famous American artist in the time, Andy Warhol, and once I am famous, produce my play. So she went up to Andy Warhol's new swanky office in 33 Union Square, took out her gun from her bag and shot him 3 times. Andy Warhol was pronounced dead as they carried him out on the ambulance from his new studio. However, as they got to the hospital, they were able to revive him. He was clinically dead for a few minutes. Andy Warhol survived. 3 major gunshot wounds on his abdomen. So much so, this was such a traumatizing experience that, according to a close friend of Andy Warhol, he said that after the shooting, he turned into a cardboard Andy Warhol. He wasn't the same. He was scared to even touch someone's hand. Andy Warhol also took a photo with the gunshot wounds, which you can see online. Weirdly enough, Andy Warhol never pressed charges, or at least he didn't testify against her. He didn't testify against her. She was charged, but since Andy Warhol didn't testify, she never got jailed. She was sent to a mental institution and released only 3 years later. She stalked Andy Warhol for a second time, and this spooked him out. Luckily, she never came approaching her again. And then, Andy Warhol apparently was afraid that Valerie Solanas would come again and shoot him. He was afraid all the way till his death in 1987, when he died of a gallbladder disease, partly due to his poor health because of the gunshots. Valerie Solanas died the next year. This is where she was detained. Now, I am so puzzled as to why would Andy Warhol not choose to testify against Valerie? I am very puzzled by that. If anyone has any theories, please let me know. Hello, Phil. Welcome. Deanna didn't know that. Oh, I hope I didn't miss too much, says Bernal. No worries, you can always watch the replay. If you don't know how Andy Warhol looked like, I'll show you a photo. Here's a photo of him, so you know how he looks like. Famous for his white hair. Famous for starting the pop art movement. Now, New York City is mistakenly known as the city filled with alleyways. However, there are barely any alleyways in New York City, period. New York City doesn't really have any alleyways. But one of the very few alleyways, and definitely one featured in a lot of films, is this one. This is Patchin Place. Let me zoom in. Patchin Place. Patchin Place was made in 1848. And currently it's known as Therapy Row. Now technically this is a open street. Anyone can walk in. However, to maintain the privacy, I'll stay outside and talk about Patchin Place. Patchin Place is one of the few alleyways in New York City built in 1848. Now, the special thing about Patchin Place is, A, it's beautiful. It's kind of separated from the rest of Greenwich Village, which was very rowdy from the 1950s all the way to about the 1980s. This ended up becoming an ideal place for artists who wanted a quiet location to contemplate, to get grounded. This was the place that they wanted to move. One of such artists was E.E. Cummings, who lived in 4 Patchin Place. E.E. Cummings is known as the second most popular poet in American history, after Robert Frost. If you know any E.E. Cummings poetry, let me know in the comments. To him, this was his little piece of heaven. He mentioned that in one of his poems. Right next to him, at number 5, Patchin Place, was his friend, Juma Barnes. Juma Barnes was very popular for writing a particular book called Nightwood, which was very explicit about homosexual relations, which at that time, again, it was a different time, it was very controversial. However, another person lived here, the sister of one of the most famous actors in American history, Marlon Brando. You might know him from The Godfather or Streetcar Named Desire. When Marlon Brando was starting his career in 1948, he had a little bit of a tough time. He was trying to make some money. So in order to save some money on rent, he stayed with his sister, Jocelyn, right here in Patchin Place. And the bell's ringing. What is that bell ringing? Well, that bell ringing is for a church? A castle? What is it? Well, we'll talk about that soon. However, a little bit more about Patchin Place is they have the oldest electric lamp. Actually, I'll walk inside. I'll show you. So they have the oldest gaslight lamp. Oldest public gaslight lamp. Christine, is that a E.E. Cummings poem? I thank you, God, for most this amazing day, for leaping greenly spirits of trees and a blue true dream of sky, and for everything which is natural and which is infinite, which is yes. Well, that's a beautiful poem. So that is one of the 2 oldest gaslight lamps, public gaslight lamps in all of New York City. There's a few older ones that are private. The other older one is in Inwood, and it was converted to electricity at the dawn of electricity in the early 1900s. Unbeing dead isn't being alive, says Mary. Ooh, I love these E.E. Cummings quotes. So 4, let's see 4. 4 is over here. 4, this is 5. This is where Juma Barnes used to live. And 4 is E.E. Cummings, and they even have a plaque. Time home of poet and painter E.E. Cummings. I'll show you a photo of E.E. Cummings. Here's him in profile. And Juma Barnes. Now, Juma Barnes apparently was a recluse. She lived at 5, right across E.E. Cummings. And she barely came out, barely had friends. She was a massive introvert. And apparently E.E. Cummings would usually come out on his daily walks and yell at number 5 Patchin Place and say, "Juma, are you still alive?" And just like messing around with her, and would just continue on his walk. He barely saw Juma himself, even though they were good friends. This alley would be known as Muse. So great question, or it's not a question, it's a comment, but interesting you say Muse. There's debate. No one knows for sure if these are Muse, because Muse are generally small alley houses, or alleyway where there's houses for people who were servants or did some type of service. This one, no one knows 100% sure why it was built. It became houses fairly quickly. However, apparently they were originally built as mews, according to a few accounts, according to a few old guidebooks, because this was built for the waiters of a hotel that was supposed to be built on Fifth Avenue, or Fifth Avenue is this way. So it's maybe Muse, but it's also a street. I don't know. It's not Stables. No, not in this case. It's not Stables. It was built as houses from the get-go. And here we have one of the very rare wall lamps, which you see more often in London, but you don't see here in New York City. All right, let's go back out. Again, it's a public street, so you can walk in, but do respect people's privacy. And actually, one more thing is, I mentioned it was called Therapy Row. There's 35 residents inside there, but 15 residences are therapist offices. They started moving in a whole lot after the year 2000. So apparently it's called Therapist Row, or Therapy Row. So if you have a therapist in this nearby area of New York City, you're probably going to this street. Here we have the Jefferson Market Library, the same name as the park right next door. And this library is not a church, it's not a castle, but it was built by a man who loved castles and who loved churches. His name was Frederick Clark Withers. Frederick Clark Withers was obsessed with one particular castle in Bavaria, Germany. And he built this courthouse, which was originally a courthouse, designed right after that castle in Bavaria, Germany, which is very hard to pronounce. Starts with an N. If anyone knows how to pronounce it, please let me know in the comments. Now, among the many women I just mentioned that were detained, they also were arraigned here at the courthouse. But there was also another famous figure that was arraigned here. His name was Henry Thaw. He was the man who shot Stanford White at the back of his head in the rooftop garden of Madison Square Park. So it says Jefferson Market Courthouse. This building was designated along Victorian lines by Vaux and Withers. It was constructed in 1876 and served as the women's courthouse until 1932. Of particular interest are the turrets, its traced ride windows, ironwork, and sculpture. And then later on in the 1970s, it became a library. It became a library in 1967. That's when it became a library. So it became a library in 1967. It was marked for demolition, which would have been insane to demolish something like this. The detention center makes sense. It's an ugly Art Deco prison. But this, thank God that they saved it. Rosen, this was based on Neuschwanstein Castle. Neuschwanstein Castle. Quite a mouthful. Neuschwanstein Castle. Beautiful. Look at that. Let's zoom in. I'll give you a better perspective from the other side soon. Now here we have a beautiful marking, and let me see if I can get a better view. I wish I can go inside the library. Again, pandemic makes it a bit difficult, but right over here we have... Now, I mentioned that Withers was obsessed with churches and with castles. He designed it also like a church. It would be filled with all imagery about Christianity. However, since this is a courthouse, it had to be secular. So he picked a scene from Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice, the courthouse scene, and this is a depiction of that scene that you're looking at right now. So if you're familiar with the Merchant of Venice, you might be able to spot which character is which. I forgot the famous line. I remember that famous line. What was the famous line? What was that famous line from Merchant of Venice? It was the amazing line where the main character, who was a Jewish man, was saying, "Am I not human if I eat?" Let me know what that line was. It's very famous for the Merchant of Venice, and it's depicting that scene. Let me know. It's not to be true or not to be. No, that's Hamlet. Here's another photo of what it used to look like with the elevated railroad right over. Pound of flesh, yes. What's that full line? There's a full line about that. Something about poison, flesh. It droppeth mercy. It droppeth as the gentle rain from heaven. A pound of flesh but cannot draw one blood. And here's another depiction of it. So now let's continue on to our next stop. If you prickly, okay, yes, Tom. If you prick me, will I not bleed? If you poison me, will I not something? Yes, I love that speech by that main character. If you prick me, will I not bleed? All right, let's go to our 2 final stops. Bernard, will there be a bonus video? Yes, there'll be a bonus video. Stay tuned around 4 p.m. 4 p.m. around there. Both on Facebook and YouTube. Yes, what's the full speech of if you prick us, do we not bleed? What's the following lines? It would be so awesome if someone could tell me like the full, not the full speech, but like those 5-6 lines. Wow, look at the clock tower. The clock tower opens up every so often from Open House New York, and also my friends at Untapped New York do amazing tours of the city, and one of the tours is going up the clock tower. So now we are walking on 6th Avenue. This is the site of the largest parade in America. That might change due to the pandemic, of course, but this 2 million people come here every single year for the Halloween parade, which I've covered before. Al Pacino makes an amazing Merchant of Venice. He does, yes. And Bernard says, awesome new haircut. Thank you so much, Bernard. Hello, Kate. It is twice blessed. It blesses he who gives and he who takes. Ooh, Marguerite, I love that other line. Your hair looks very smart today. Oh, thank you so much, Phil. So Donald says, hath not a Jew eyes, hath not a Jew hands, organs, dimensions, senses, affections, passions, fed with the same food, hurt with the same weapons. Subject to the same diseases, healed by the same means, worn and cooled by the same winter and summer as a Christian is. If you prick us, do we not bleed? Oh, I love it. Yes, that was the line. Thank you so much, everyone. That was my attempted reading of Shakespeare as I'm walking around with a mask. I do my best, everyone. I do my best. Beautiful houses. Here we see very old style row houses that you barely see in Greenwich Village or most of New York. Very similar to the style houses that were depicted in the Edward Hopper painting. I think it was called 7th Avenue, the Edward Hopper painting. Now let's turn on 11th Street on 6th Avenue between 6th and 5th, and we're going to a tiny little secret. Speaking of the Jewish faith, of the Jewish community, they only had one congregation for almost 200 years. From 1654 all the way to the 1840s, Shearith, Israel was the only congregation for Jews. At first, it was Spanish and Portuguese Jews. They had a synagogue nearby. And then Jews started coming from Eastern Europe, and they had to join the congregation that they weren't really familiar with, because Spanish and Portuguese Jews spoke a different language. It wasn't Yiddish. It was Lido, I think it was called. And they also have very different customs. That said, all the Jews had to be buried in the same congregation, and they started running out of space in the first cemetery, which was a little bit around Chambers Street. This was their extension. Here we have an obelisk. And unfortunately, it is a pale comparison of what it used to be. It's a pale comparison of what it used to be, because in the mid-1800s, an epidemic ravaged New York. Wait a minute, isn't that what's happening today? Epidemic or pandemic? Well, pandemics and epidemics are nothing new. They might seem new because we basically erased our history of pandemics in our textbooks. And in our guidebooks, there's barely any sites that are related to any type of pandemic. However, New York City was ravaged by yellow fever. And yellow fever killed people by the tens of thousands in the US. That meant a lot of bodies started packing up. Most of the city was below Chambers Street, and they started running out of graves. But the thing is, one of the main concerns of yellow fever, because usually when you bury a grave, there's mosquitoes around. And they feared that the graves themselves were the cause for yellow fever. And they banned graves. They first banned graves below Chambers Street. So the Jewish congregation of Shearith, Israel, had to move here, further uptown. They had a much larger grave with more than 100 bodies. However, they also ran out of space, so they had to move to a third stop in Chelsea. And then Manhattan was done with graveyards and banned all graveyards below 86th Street. And that's where we have these massive graves built in Calvary Cemetery in Queens. So this is just a tiny piece of the much larger cemetery which used to exist here. The bodies were moved to the Chelsea location, which still exists to this day. And it's a little bit larger than this one. So yeah, it's a tiny little cemetery. Let me see if I can get a better view. Yeah, let's see if we can zoom in on one of the stones. I wish it were open. I'm being bitten by mosquitoes as we speak. I hope there is no yellow fever. And you can barely see the name here, but it says Isaac Harry in that stone. Donald says, oy vey, that's a small cemetery. Yeah, it is very small. You see the smaller gravestones. And there's headstones by the wall, and of course the obelisk. Obelisk is strange. I didn't know Jewish people would use the obelisk. I guess it wasn't really secular to begin with. I mean, it was secular to begin with. Ladino, thank you so much. Ladino was the language that the Spanish and Portuguese Jewish community spoke. And now for a final stop. Let's go down 11th Street. And as we're going down 11th Street, let's enjoy the views. Across the street is Jean's Restaurant, which is 101 years old. Oh, interesting. I didn't know that. Thank you for the fact, Marguerite. History tells that Washington Square Park too has graves. Yes, Washington Square Park used to be a potter's field. So unmarked graves, and also people who couldn't afford proper graves were buried there. Cars are... Thank you everyone so much for putting the words. May put further words. If you prick us, do we not bleed? If you poison us, do we not die? And if you wrong us, shall we not revenge? If we are like you in the rest, we will resemble you in that. Shakespeare was such a great writer. And this was quoted in the Academy Award-winning film, The Piano, or The Pianist. The Pianist. And that's where I really first heard the line. And then I subsequently watched the Al Pacino movie. Pew! This is the plan. You're seeing the video right now. It's in Chinatown, yes. Shirth Israel is in the Chinatown area. The original cemetery. The first cemetery. Right over here. March 6, 1970, at 11:55 a.m., a huge explosion rocked this block at 1118 West 11th Street. Now, a lot of the houses we see here are historic, built in the 1840s. But this one is rather modern and recently sold for $9 million. It's because it was redesigned later on in the late 1970s. But why? Well, that was due to the explosion of a radical leftist group called the Weather Underground. No, I'm not talking about the app. It's a great app. I'm talking about the radical group that branched out of the Student for Democracy Society in 1969 and radicalized, became militarized, and decided to start bombing and do a violent overthrow of the American government. So what happened here? Well, for that, we first have to look at this woman over here, Kathy P. Wilkerson. Kathy P. Wilkerson was the daughter of a radio executive who lived right here. However, her dad and her stepmom took a trip out to Bermuda, and she had the place all to herself. She convinced her friends to come over here, but the friends she kept weren't innocent. They were part of the Weather Underground, and they were planning to plant bombs all around major forts and major libraries and major governmental buildings in the U.S. So where does the name the Weathermen come from, or the Weather Underground? And they called themselves Weathermen. It comes from the famous line from a Bob Dylan song, "You don't need a weatherman to know which way the wind blows." So, on that day of March 6, 1970, Kathy Wilkerson, Kathy Bowden, and 3 others, Terry Robinson was another one, all came here. Terry Robbins was, they all came here and started planning to plant bombs at Fort Wilkes in South New Jersey and Columbia University. However, they weren't experienced bomb makers. They planted a few bombs before and they just end up being minor inconveniences for blowing up a tiny little part of a governmental building. Nothing severe. They weren't really that effective. Also, the Weather Underground was actually at first funded by the FBI. But why? Well, I mentioned the Student for Democracy Society. That group was 80,000 students strong, and they were left-leaning, mostly communist philosophies. But they preferred peaceful protest. Does this sound familiar? Yes, it does. History is repeating itself right now, but I don't talk about politics. However, it's easy to learn about current events if you look into history. So what happened? FBI started putting in money secretly, and the documents recently came out, to fund a few of these more radicalized students for democracy to take over the group, and they did. However, most people disagreed with making military operations. They disagreed with the violent overthrow of the government, and they almost lost the entire base, and it shrunk to 600 people. And they only had 3 branches, one of them here in New York. The Weathermen end up actually having a few bombs, weren't really too effective, and the FBI couldn't actually catch them. Did they want to catch them? Maybe, maybe not. However, when they tried, the FBI wasn't actually allowed to wear plain clothes, as mandated by J. Edgar Hoover, the owner of the FBI and the CIA. They were mandated to wear shirt and tie. So they couldn't fit in with these group of hippies, because most of them were hippies. So here, Kathy Wilkerson convinced her friends to use this as their new den for anarchy. They were fiddling with the bombs. One of them, the owners came in. One of them really didn't know how to use a bomb, so he struggled. And Kathy was telling him, hey, you know, maybe you should try it the other way. Things might go wrong. And that day, boom, the entire house exploded. It left a huge hole in this street. This is the explosion that was here. Dozens of firemen came to the rescue. Kathy Wilkerson and her friend Kathy Boudon survived. But the other 3, unfortunately, died. Theodore Gold, who was the age of 22, Diana Oten at the age of 28, and Terry Robbins at the age of 22. He was the one who was responsible for building the bomb and really messed up. Apparently he crossed his wires incorrectly. They found pounds of dynamite in here. Apparently it was the biggest find of explosives by non-military personnel here in New York City history. They had enough firepower to blow half of this block. If more of the dynamite blew up, all these houses might have blown up as well, including right next door, the house of famous actor Dustin Hoffman. He was celebrating the birthday of his adopted daughter, who was turning 4 years old that very day. Unfortunately, it was interrupted. Part of his house was burned down, as we see in the photos below. And he had to rescue some of his goods. Luckily, he survived and his daughter survived. However, apparently, according to his daughter, when she recollected, Dustin knelt down and said, hey, everything is going to be okay. Everything's going to be okay. And her daughter simply asked, if everything's going to be okay, why are you shaking so hard? Dustin, of course, naturally was extremely rattled by this sudden explosion. Luckily, the Weathermen never got to fulfill their plans because This time, they didn't intend to merely blow up a building with minimal casualties. They intended to kill. Now, one of them, Kathy Baudon, actually ended up becoming a professor, which is rather weird. They turned themselves in 18... Well, actually, it wasn't Kathy. It was someone else in the Weather Underground. But she turned herself in 1980. And Kathy Wilkerson also turned herself in 1980. Because as both of them were escaping the fiery blaze and their three other friends dead, apparently one of them found a metro token, or a subway token, took it and ran to the subway and escaped and evaded the FBI for 10 whole years until they turned themselves in. Kind of a crazy story. So that is 18 West 11th Street. We did a circle around around Greenwich Village. Thank you everyone so much for watching. If you want to see more of my videos, I go on live every 1 p.m. on Wednesdays and Saturdays. If you want to lend your support, you can press that star button or that become a supporter button on Facebook, or if you're on YouTube, you can become a patron at patreon.com/urbanist. Let me read a few of your comments. Mitch says they represent peace. No, they didn't. Tuba, good to see you too. Love your channel, hermano. Thank you so much, Ron. And that's how I came here too. Ahmad says a couple of weeks ago, Kenneth Action Kid was telling people to watch Urbanist if you do not know the history of New York City. Also informed that you went live walks for more than 4 hours. Yes, indeed I do. And I actually don't hate the modern design. I actually really like the modern design, Bernard. Yeah, you're right. It's a beautiful design. Dustin Hoffman lived on the building on the right. Yes. He did. So I'm going to put a map of all the places we visited after this is done. And I'm most likely going to do a bonus live video around 4 p.m. So put on notifications on YouTube, put on notifications on Facebook so you know exactly when I go live. And everyone, thank you so much for watching. Keep being awesome and always keep on exploring. Have a great day, everyone. Have a great day, everyone.